I want to take you back to the era of the DVD. I think you know what I'm talking about. You pop in the disc, the menu loads, and you've got options. You can play the movie or you could go exploring, okay? We got behind the scenes features, deleted scenes, director's commentary, sometimes bloopers. And if you were anything like me, after you watched the movie, that's exactly what you were diving into. So one day, my family, when I was probably about 14 or 15, rented The Incredibles from Redbox, okay? It had just come out fairly recently, and I did what I always do after the movie, go and check out the nerdy director's commentary stuff. And there was a behind the scenes feature about a deleted scene from the movie. And here's what they cut. There originally was going to be a pilot, an older man who was a friend of the family. He was going to be the one to fly Helen and the kids to the island. And when Syndrome's missiles locked in on that plane, he was going to go down with it. He was going to die. His name was Snug Porter, and we never got to see him. The reason they gave for cutting the scene was that the death would have been too heavy, too traumatic, and too much for the audience. And I remember sitting there 14 years old and not being able to fully articulate why that made me a little bit uncomfortable. It just kind of didn't sit right with me. Because I was also a child once and was still technically a child at the time, and it felt like that type of protection didn't necessarily feel like it was extended to people who looked like me. So I couldn't really explain why I felt that way at the time. I just knew that I did. And then years went by and more movies came out, and I feel like that feeling just kept coming back. They cut the scene out because it was too traumatic. But too traumatic for who exactly? What is up, home slices? And if you're new here, welcome. I'm so glad that this video found you. My name is Kiara, and this is the Sup Media Reviews platform. What we do here is pretty simple. We love media. We talk about movies, TV shows, and music, and we're especially fond of the ones that are a little on the older side, okay? Our podcast has over 70 episodes of us reviewing old films and shows and music from at least 20 years ago and asking some key questions like, how does this make you feel? Does it hold up today? And is it worth revisiting? Because that's really what this channel is kind of about at its core. Nostalgia, emotion, the way that a song or a movie can pull you back into the feeling from when you first watched it. Kind of like nothing else can. And if that sounds like your kind of thing, the podcast will be linked for you below. We also have our top 5 video series where I sit down with some of my favorite people and count down our favorite things that we rank around different pieces of media, such as best holiday movies or best TV dads. It's a great place to start if you're just getting to know our channel. And now we're doing something new. Now, this series is called VopEd, which is short for video op-ed, and the idea behind it is exactly what it sounds like. An op-ed isn't a research paper and it's not peer-reviewed. It's one person saying, I've been thinking about this thing and I have some feelings and a little bit of evidence, and that's what I want to talk about. So that's essentially what this video is. I am not a film scholar. I am someone who feels things deeply, and when I watch media, I've learned to pay attention to those feelings. As a Black woman, I think a lot about the fact that we are often the first ones to sense when something is off, even before there's really language for it. So we just kind of know. So I sat with that feeling for a little bit. I did some research. I watched a lot of movies, and I want to share what I found around Disney and themes of grief and death as they relate to race. I'm here to have an open and honest conversation about what I ended up finding, and it is kind of surprising to me. I'm not here to tell you what to think. I just want to show you what I noticed, how I explored those feelings, and the conclusion that I came to. And whatever you do with that is up to you. So here's where I started. Here's my theory that we're going to test today. Disney movies made for children of color will score measurably higher on a grief scale than films made for a predominantly white audience. I believe for a long time that when Disney makes a movie for children of color and when the story centers Black, Latinx, or Asian characters, that those stories lean harder into death, grief, and loss than stories that are made primarily for white children. And I kind of wanted to test that, so I built a system. It is completely subjective, but I did my best to hold myself to the same standard across all of the films. And today you kind of get to be the judge of if I did a good job or not. Now, I looked at 25 Disney and Pixar films released since 1998. I chose 1998 as my starting point because that's roughly when Disney started making films that felt genuinely culturally intentional. Those stories that didn't just borrow cultural aesthetics, but were actually trying to center those cultural experiences. So Mulan was released in 1998, and that felt like a good starting point. Also eliminated things like sequels or movies that had inanimate objects such as cars, because why? There are a few exceptions though, and we'll talk about those later. But I divided those 25 films into 3 categories. Films that I believe were primarily for white audiences, films I believe were primarily made for audiences of color, and then finally a gray area category for films that where the intended audience is kind of debatable. So I scored every single one of them on a grief scale that I made up, and we're going to talk about them today. Now, here is how the scoring works. I created 6 criteria, each one designed to measure how heavily death and grief figure into a film's story. The maximum score is 9 points. The criteria are as follows. Criteria number 1, is there a death of a parent, family member, close friend, or mentor in this film? 1 point for yes and a 0 for no. And if the answer to this criterion is no, then the film scores a 0. We don't move any further. Criteria number 2, how well do we know the character before we lose them? 0 points if we never meet the character or they're already gone before the story begins. 1 point if we briefly meet them, and 2 points if we spend meaningful time with them and feel genuinely attached before they pass away. Criteria number 3, is the death shown on screen? It's 1 point for yes and a 0 if the death is off screen, implied, or happens before the film begins. Criteria number 4, does the character die violently or intentionally? 1 point for deliberate murder, a half point for a violent death but without malicious intent, and 0 for illness, old age, or natural causes. Criteria number 5, how central is grief to the story? 1 point if the grief is mentioned but the story moves on. 2 points if the grief motivates the protagonist but isn't the main plot, and 3 points if grief is the main plot and the story literally cannot exist without it. And finally, criteria number 6, is the death permanent? 1 point if yes, and 0 if the story softens or reverses the loss by the end of the movie. I also created a little bit of a little grief modifier, which is an additional half point for films where there's a significant grief adjacent loss that doesn't involve a traditional death. Things like abandonment, a character being turned into stone, a child not knowing their birth parent, things along those lines. It doesn't score as high as death does, but I do think that it counts for something because grief looks different for different people. Now, the scale runs from 0 to 9, and 0 means no real meaningful death happens in the story, whereas 9 means that grief is everything, okay? It's total, it's permanent, and it plays a major part in the film, and the film was basically nothing without it. Well, for the sake of time, I don't want to have to go through for each of the 25 films and show you the specific scores in each criterion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to include a link down below in the description where you can click on it and see the exact scores for each one of these films to show you how I arrived to the final score for each of these movies. So check it out if you're interested to see exactly how I arrived at the final scores. Now let's go ahead and get into it. Now, before I show you the scores, I want to take a moment and explain why I think that any of this is worth examining, because it's not just about the movies. Now, we've talked about before how Disney films have made Black characters animals for large portions of the movies that they're in, which kind of denies them of their humanity. But my theory suggests that maybe sometimes we're treated a little too human, where the full weight of grief really is a big part of the story. But all of that comes back to a basic concept that researchers and child psychologists have studied called adult-itification bias. And it basically describes this idea that there is a documented, measurable tendency for Black children and other children of color to be perceived as older than they are, less innocent, less in need of protection, comfort, and gentleness than their white peers. We see this all around us all the time. In 2017, Georgetown Law's Center on Poverty and Inequality released a study called Girlhood Interrupted: The Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood. What they found was that adults across race and background perceive Black girls as more adult-like than white girls of the same age, starting as young as 5 years old. I can tell you from my own life experience that this is real. From the time I was a preteen and throughout my teens, there were grown men who would approach me and ask me for my number, which is totally inappropriate. There were moments where I would be with smaller children and those children were presumed to be my children instead of my cousins or a child that I knew. So in my own life, I have experienced that same adultification bias. I feel like lots of people who are people of color would experience something along those lines. I think it's really important because this adultification bias has really big implications. Black girls are suspended more than 5 times as often as white girls, and they're 2.7 times more likely to be referred to the juvenile justice system. Black youth make up almost 50% of the youth juvenile system, but they only comprise of about 15% of the youth population. Same behaviors, but different outcomes, because the child themselves is being perceived differently. We have Tamir Rice, who was 12 years old when he was shot and killed by a police officer in Cleveland while playing with a toy gun in the park. And Trayvon Martin, who was 17, walking home from a convenience store. You know, these are real life examples of children who were not afforded the innocence that their age really entitled them to. And so while Disney Pixar, of course, is not responsible for those tragedies, I'm trying to see as if that cultural logic trickles down to even the children's movies that our children watch today. The idea that children of color are somehow more adult or more capable of handling heavy things or are in less need of gentleness, I think that that logic flows through the fabric of so many things that we have here in America, whether it's the justice system, and I'm trying to get a gauge on whether or not it actually lives in the stories that children watch, especially when they're just trying to escape the world and enter a world of magic and adventure. So let's take a look at what I found. All right, let's get started with the films that I categorize as being made primarily for white audiences. We got 10 films total. I'm going to start with the ones that scored a 0 because there are 3 of them. Now, these 3 movies that scored a 0 on the grief scale are Brave, The Incredibles, and Wreck-It Ralph. Now, none of these movies include a meaningful death. There's no real grief or no loss of anyone that we care about. In Brave, Merida's mother nearly turns into a bear permanently, but the spell is reversed. In The Incredibles, there's a staggering body count of superheroes who are killed off screen by the villain, but we never meet any of them, so we never grieve any of them. And in Wreck-It Ralph, there is the threat of death that exists as, you know, in the game mechanics and whatnot, but it never actually lands on anyone that we love or care about in the story. So these 3 films that I would consider to be primarily targeting a white audience have 0 out of 9 on the grief scale. Now let's move up. Let's talk about Meet the Robinsons. Now, this movie received a score of 5.5, and this movie actually surprised me because I had never seen it before. The grief in this film is actually centered on Lewis's longing for his birth mother, a woman who he never met, who he doesn't know is alive or dead, and that longing drives the entire story. There is a robot named Carl who is destroyed on screen, and he comes back later because he's a machine or whatever, but the movie is a little heavier than I expected for a relatively obscure Disney film. The sense of abandonment from his birth mother plays a big role in it, and I was kind of pleasantly surprised. Next up, let's talk about the movies that scored a 6 on the scale. We have Frozen, Tangled, and Onward. Now, in Frozen, the girls Anna and Elsa lose both their parents in a shipwreck. We briefly meet them before they're gone. Tangled has a murder scene in it, essentially, where Flynn Rider dies on screen because he gets stabbed by Mother Gothel, but he's immediately resurrected by Rapunzel's tears. So the permanence criterion and the grief is kind of curtailed by the fact that even though we know him and we really like this character, he's dead for like a minute, okay? Now, Onward is about two elf brothers who spend the whole movie trying to bring their dead dad back for one day. So grief is very much the engine in that movie, but the story keeps it light through some adventure and humor. I had never seen Onward before. I really enjoyed it, but I do want to defend that I consider this a white movie because even though the boys are like blue trolls, the characters in the story are racialized. There's one character who is a manticore who is clearly a black woman. So I feel certain that Onward is targeting a white audience. Next up, we have Inside Out at a 6.5. Initially, I was like, Inside Out doesn't really have any meaningful deaths in it. But then I thought about it and y'all, Bing Bong is dead, okay? Bing Bong, the imaginary friend, is dead, okay? Riley had an imaginary friend. He ends up sacrificing himself and fading away in the memory dump on screen, and it's devastating, okay? We get to spend some real time with him. He's there for quite a bit of the movie, and his fading is actually a metaphor for Riley losing that part of her childhood. So I did add a little bit of a grief modifier here for the larger emotional layer. Next up, scoring a 7 is Up. Now, Ellie's death and the death of the wife in the movie Up is handled in this little short montage that covers the entire marriage of Carl and Ellie. It includes a miscarriage. It includes a funeral. And we barely hear Ellie speak at all, but we are devastated, y'all. Look, that first few little minutes of Up, devastation, okay? When she's gone, baby, that tears me up every time, okay? Carl ends up spending the whole film trying to fulfill his promise that he made to her. So this movie scores a little higher on the scale, and we'll come back to why in a little minute. Now, the final and highest scoring film on this list is Tarzan at a 7.5. Now, Tarzan's parents are killed by a leopard, and we meet them a little bit, so there's that. But then we have Kerchak, who is the gorilla patriarch who really couldn't accept Tarzan. He was kind of mean to him, but he does sacrifice himself and ends up getting shot on screen by Clayton, the villain, okay? So we got multiple deaths in here. We got multiple opportunities for grief, and so this one scores a little higher. Now, the white audience average is 4.5 out of 9. The median or the middle score is 6. And when I look at the most common scores for white audience films on this scale, it's actually a tie between 0 and 6. Both of these appear 3 times each. So 3 films score a 0, 3 films score a 6. And I think that's actually a little more interesting than having one clear mode, because to me, what it says is that white audience films are just as likely to have no meaningful death at all as they are to sit comfortably towards the middle of the scale, like a middle but like a little bit higher. There are no white audience films that score above a 7.5 on this 9-point scale, and the floor or the bottom of what's possible looks very different than what we're about to see on the other side, so keep that in mind. Okay, now let's look at the films that I categorize as being made primarily for audiences of color. also 10 films, okay? And just like the white audience films, I'm going to start with the zeros and we're going to work our way up the scale because there are actually 2 films here that have scored a 0. Now, on the 0 scale, we have Turning Red and Strange World, which both scored 0. Now, Turning Red is about a Chinese Canadian girl who is going through puberty. There's some generational expectations and a red panda transformation, but there's no real death or grief in the traditional sense. Strange World, which is a movie that I actually had not heard of and is still relatively new, has a protagonist who spent 25 years without his father and was presumed dead, but the father comes back, so the loss isn't permanent. But depending on who you ask, the main character is a biracial but mostly black presenting 15-year-old. So this probably could have qualified as a gray area film, but I feel confident in saying that it should be on the people of color list. Okay, now these are 2 of the most recent and most culturally specific POC films on my list, and they both score a 0. And I think this is worth noting because it could suggest that Disney is moving away from centering grief and could be evolving the way that they tell stories. So it could be a good thing. I do want to point out that Strange World actually had a gay character, and I was like, whoa. I don't remember hearing about the movie Strange World. I don't remember any advertising for it at all whatsoever. I think it might have been made for streaming. Who really knows? But I was like, dang, this is kind of revolutionary. Not just POC, but also not depicting only heterosexual characters. It's kind of a big deal. Now let's move up the scale. Next up, we have Mulan at a 3.5. Now, the reason this gets a 3.5, even though the movie centers around war and all that good stuff, is that the death here that we primarily feel belongs to General Li, who is Shang's father. He's not Mulan's father. It does happen off screen during wartime, and Mulan is affected by this loss, but it's not really her grief to carry. So we had to lower the scores a little bit because the loss didn't belong to the main protagonist of the film. And so the score kind of reflects that there's a distance between the grief and our main character. Next up, we have Lilo and Stitch coming in at a 4.5. Now, Lilo and Nani's parents died in a car accident before the story begins. And while we never meet them, there is a photograph that we see of them that Lilo keeps under her pillow. And it's her father who coined the phrase Ohana means family, and family means nobody gets left behind or forgotten. And that phrase, of course, runs through the whole film and is essentially the story and is essentially the lesson that Stitch needs to learn. Okay, so the absence of these parents actually shapes kind of many things that happen in the story, including the custody situation and Nani's sacrifice and the fact that she has to take care of her sister and the urgency in the film. But besides the death of the parents that we don't see on film, there's not really much else in the grief arena. Now, next up, we got Encanto at a 5.5. Now, Abuelo Pedro is murdered by soldiers in the opening. Okay, we kind of see it happen, and his death is what ends up triggering the magic candle and sets the family on the whole, magical family trajectory. Okay, we got 3 generations of trauma flowing from that one moment of loss, but because Maribel's journey is more about belonging and identity than about grieving the grandfather, this movie does not score as high as you might expect. So there is generational trauma, but the grief more so belongs to Maribel's grandmother, whose name is Alma, than our protagonist herself. Next up, we have 2 films that score a 7 on the scale. They are Moana and Raya the Last Dragon. Now, in Moana, we lose Grandma Tala. She dies of an illness or old age. We watch her in her deathbed, but her spirit does stay with Moana as a stingray, which kind of softens the permanence of her loss a little bit, which is why it didn't score higher. Now, in Raya the Last Dragon, we spend the whole film with Sisu, the dragon, and we watch her get shot with an arrow. Okay, she is revived in the end, but the grief of that moment is pretty heavy. Okay, and across the whole film, everyone around Raya is grieving family members who've been turned into stone, which is its own kind of grief, even though it's not permanent. So I added a little modifier for that one. So those are the movies that scored 7. Next up, we have Soul, which scored a 7.5, which is a little bit surprising to me, okay, considering the topic of this freaking movie, but let's talk about why. Now, Joe Gardner, the main character, dies within the first 10 minutes. He falls down a manhole, and the whole film is a meditation on what life means and whether the things we spend our lives chasing are actually the things that matters. One of the things that I did consider and add a grief modifier for is that Joe's father, Ray, I think was his name, was also a musician who has passed away, and living up to that expectation but also not wanting to struggle like his dad did colors his journey and everything. So I did add a little grief modifier there, even though the main death that we focused on is Joe's himself, okay? Interestingly enough, Joe does get a second chance at the end, so the permanence criterion is not met, but the film does earn a 7.5 because of how completely death saturates this entire film, okay? Next up at an 8, we have Princess and the Frog, okay? There's a couple of deaths in this movie that we, experience, okay? We lose James, who is Tiana's father. It's a man that we meet for just a little minute or two and that we love. And a big part of the reason why she wants to open a restaurant is because of her father's memory. So it does have some motivating factor for Tiana, okay? And then towards the end of the movie, we lose Ray, the firefly who ends up being murdered and squashed by Dr. Facilier, and we see him die on the screen. It's 2 losses and they both suck. Ray does turn into a star. So maybe there's a little non-permanence to that. So yeah, that's where we are. Princess and the Frog is an 8. Now let's move on to the last and highest scoring POC film. It is Coco at an 8.5. Now this entire movie is about death, okay? It's about Dia de los Muertos. It's about what it means to be remembered after you pass. We learned that Hector, who is Miguel's great-great-grandfather, was poisoned and murdered by his best friend who stole his songs, okay? We watch it happen in a flashback, and at the end we watch Mama Coco, Miguel's great-grandmother, who is frail and fading. She dies too at the end of the movie, okay? So the death isn't necessarily shown, but it is felt. And the only reason Coco doesn't get a perfect score of 9 is because of the land of the dead. Death in this film is about transition and it's not an ending. And it means that you, on some level, can and will be reunited with your family members, which kind of changes the permanence on things a little slightly. So there we have it. Now, the POC audience average is a 5.2 out of 9. The median is 6.25, and the most common score for a POC audience film is a 7 out of 9. Now, let's put these two categories side by side. For white audience films, the most common scores are 0 and 6, tied with 3 films each. And if you look at where those white audience films land on the grief scale, they cluster more middle right. The bulk of them sit somewhere between 5 and 7, with 3 films pulling all the way down to 0. Now, for POC audience films, the most common scores are 0 and 7, also tied with 2 films at each. But here's what's interesting. Even though the most common scores are tied the same way, look at where the POC films actually land on that scale. 5 out of 10 of the POC films, which are exactly half of the ones that I examined, score a 7 or higher. Half of the films made for POC audiences are landing in the upper range on the grief scale. And yes, the averages are actually quite close. We got 5.2 for POC films versus 4.5 for white films. It's only a difference of 0.7, and on paper, that's pretty modest. But the averages don't show you the distribution. And I think the distribution is where the story kind of lives. When you look at the grief scale visually, you can see that the green stars, the POC audience films, are leaning towards the higher end, whereas the orangish red stars, the white audience films, are spread across the middle right and the bottom. The highest scores on this entire scale belong to predominantly films for audiences of color. And that's not nothing, even if the gap in the averages is smaller than I expected. But even if you do look at at the averages, there is slightly more grief in the POC films. We have 4.5 versus a 5.2. So there is a little bit of a difference, but not as big as I was expecting, which is kind of interesting. Now let's talk about the gray area, okay? Now there are 5 films in this category where I genuinely thought it was kind of debatable about which category these films belong into. Maybe because the characters aren't clearly coded as one race, or because the cultural specificity is ambiguous, or because the film predates the era of the intentional representation that I talked about earlier. So let's take it from the top this time. Let's talk about Lion King, okay? It is a perfect 9. Now, I know what you're thinking. The Lion King came out in 1994, and that is before my 1998 cutoff, okay? The characters are lions and not humans, so why is it here? I cannot talk about grief and death in Disney or Disney Pixar films without talking about freaking Mufasa, okay? Mufasa was voiced by James Earl Jones. Madge Sinclair voices Sarabi. The singing voice of Simba is a black kid, Jason Weaver. The film takes place in Africa. The 2019 remake and the recent Mufasa films both feature predominantly black voice cast. Now, I think that you can make a strong argument that The Lion King fits into the POC film category, but I left it here so you can make your own decision. But as it is, the most devastating, most unflinching, most emotionally raw parental death in the entire Disney canon belongs to The Lion King, okay? Mufasa is murdered on screen by his own brother. Simba basically watches it happen and believes it's his fault, and he spends the rest of the film running away from that grief. So the story really can't exist without it. This movie scores a perfect 9. Next up, we have Big Hero 6 at an 8.5. Now, this one surprised me quite a bit. I'd never seen the movie before, watching it for, this VopEd here. And Hiro, the main character, is a biracial Japanese-American teenager who loses his brother Tadashi in a fire that was deliberately set by the villain. We spend about 25 minutes with Tadashi before he's gone. He is warm, caring, and brilliant, and his death really is the engine of everything that follows. And because the fire that he died in was arson, and maybe there's a little bit of debate about that, it's murder. So Big Hero 6 scores higher than most of my POC audience films, but he appears to be mixed race, and I'm not 100% sure which audience they were actually targeting. Next up, we got Finding Nemo. This is a movie that is mostly about animals. I would say it's a little more white leaning than otherwise, but because it's fish, who freaking knows? Okay, Finding Nemo scores a 5, and the main death that we see in the story is Coral, who is Nemo's mother. She and 400 of her eggs are killed by a barracuda in the opening scene of the movie. And while we barely know her, we do feel the loss a little bit. And another thing to note is that the whole way that Marlin interacts with Nemo is based on how scary he thinks the ocean is and how unsafe it is. And that's as a result of Coral's death. So it does have some bearing on the story. Let's move on to Wish. Now, Wish scored a 3, and Asha, who's the main character, is clearly black, but she's living in a multicultural immigrant city. She did lose her father to an illness before the story begins, and we only see him in a photograph. So the grief there is present, but it's not that much of a big deal and doesn't make that big of an impact in the story. Also, that movie, a lot of people didn't watch it. There's a lot of reasons for that, but let's move on. And lastly, we have Luca. Now, Luca for me scored a 0.5. And I'll talk a little bit about that. The movie is set in Italy, and the reason why I think that it's kind of a gray area film is depending on who you ask and what time period in history. Italians aren't always considered white, even though they are technically European. But these are sea monster protagonists who can transform once they're out of water into humans. Nobody dies in this film, but I did do a little adjustment for a grief modifier for Alberto's abandonment by his father. He literally does not know where his father is. He could be alive or dead, and that colors who he is. So he's like the protagonist sidekick, so it doesn't weigh as heavily on the story as if it was affecting the protagonist directly. So it does get a little 0.5 modifier. Okay. So let's talk about the average for the gray area films. We got 5.2 out of 9, but look at where that average comes from. Lion King and Big Hero 6, which to me both lean towards people of color, score a 9 and an 8.5. Luca and Wish, can't really tell where they're leaning. They score on the lower end. I think I'm going to leave it up to you to decide if the gray area films create a meaningful difference in the movies that target non-POC children versus POC children. To me, I do think that Lion King and Big Hero 6 lean more POC, so that kind of bumps up the average for me a little bit. So here are what the numbers say. POC audience films average a 5.2 out of 9. White audience films average a 4.5 out of 9. And the gray area films average a 5.2 out of 9, which are pulled up significantly by The Lion King and Big Hero 6, which I think lean a little more POC. Now, the gap between the POC and white audience films is only 0.7 points. And while I think that feels measurable and there is a difference, it's way smaller than I expected going in. Okay. And I want to be honest with you about why I think that is and what I think that means. My theory, I think, is only partially supported, but not in such a dramatic fashion as I thought it would be. I think the truth is that Disney doesn't care who you are. You will have a dead parent or a dead friend or something happen in your movie. Okay. Because Disney is obsessed with grief and loss and tragic backstories across all of their films, because you need to have someone to root for, okay? Regardless of who the film is made for, we all love a protagonist that we like and that we want to win, and it just works better if something bad happened to them, okay? Parental death, mentor loss, grief as a motivator, these are a part of the Disney formula, okay? And the difference between white audience films and the POC films on my scale are actually pretty modest, not even a full point apart. But here's where it gets interesting. When I look at the most common score in each category rather than the average, the picture shifts a little bit. The most common score for white audiences film is either 0 or 6, where the most common score for a POC audience film is a 7. So to me, that means that when a white audience film doesn't center grief at all, it really doesn't. And then there are moments where it is centered, but not as much as POC films. Okay, so take what you will from that. And if you remember at the beginning of the movie, I talked about deleted scenes. And actually the biggest difference comes in the deleted scenes, which means I probably didn't have to go through the trouble of making this freaking scale and watching a bunch of movies I had never seen before. But come to find out, there are multiple Disney movies that are targeted towards white audiences that scaled back on the way that we experience grief in those white films. There's documentation of deleted scenes where more graphic or devastating deaths were cut from the final version. And the reason that they gave was consistently some version of it was just too much for the audience. In Tarzan, we actually see a more graphic depiction of Tarzan's father being killed by Sabor the leopard. And Finding Nemo, they were going to show Coral's body literally inside the barracuda's mouth, which was cut for being too scary. In The Incredibles, as I talked about earlier, they were going to show Snug, who was a family friend, dying in that plane crash, but they cut that. And, the reason was that it was too traumatic. And this movie wasn't on the list, but there is a deleted scene that was showing a more graphic version of Bambi's mother's death. But you get what I'm saying, okay? So we have multiple confirmed cases where Disney looked at the death of a beloved character, or I'll say a positive character, and decided that it was too much for the audience. I was not able to find a confirmed deleted scene from Coco, Soul, Princess and the Frog, Encanto, or Moana where Disney pulled back from showing the death of a beloved character because it was too heavy. They kind of leaned in. So maybe the gap really isn't in the final scores. Maybe the gap in which audience Disney or Pixar instinctively reaches out to protect, and which audience they trust to handle the full weight of loss without really being shielded from it. And that instinct, which is probably unconscious and probably well-intentioned, is worth examining, because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in this culture that has a long and documented history of deciding that children of color don't need the same protection, the same gentleness, or the same careful handling that white children receive. And I'm not saying Disney is virtuous. I'm saying Disney is a product of the culture that it exists in, okay? And that applies to so many of us. So here's essentially where I landed. The theory from the beginning of the video is supported, but only slightly. The gap between the average score for white audience films and POC audience films is 0.7. It means something, but it's small, y'all. That's way smaller than I expected going in. And I figured I'd be super honest and try to be as objective as I could be on such a subjective topic, including the fact that I made up my own scale to measure these films. Okay. So I'm just going to be honest with y'all about my findings, as opposed to trying to convince you of something that don't make sense. Okay. So I have a lot of integrity there, but there are things that I think that my scale didn't fully capture. There is a difference between a movie that involves death and a movie that is about death. And so Onward, for instance, which I identified as a film for white audiences, scored a 6 on my scale, and it's justified. We get two brothers who spend the whole movie trying to bring their dad back for one day, but the way that the grief shows up in that film is wrapped up in adventure and humor and brotherhood. And so the movie uses grief as this kind of launching pad, but it takes you to this lighter place, and you laugh, and the dad's legs are literally doing physical comedy for most of the film. But then we switch over to a movie like Coco. Coco scored high on my scale as well, but there's kind of no launching pad. Grief really is the destination. And even though the way grief is handled does have some levity because it's a children's movie and because it's about celebrating and honoring people who have passed away, the entire film is an exploration of what it means to lose someone or to be forgotten. There are 5 generations of, family trauma. And I feel like there is still a little bit of a heaviness that you feel that doesn't necessarily feel the same for Onward. And I think the same is true for Soul. Like, conceptually, the whole movie is about dying and life and what happens to you after. And to me, that's less of a backdrop and really the whole question at the center of the story. So my scale gave both Onward and Coco higher scores, but for whatever reason, the feeling that I get from watching it doesn't feel the same. So I think that that's worth naming. I don't think my scale really captured that, even though I made an attempt to. So when I put everything together with the scores and the distributions and the deleted scenes and the weight of how grief actually shows up in the stories, I think that the theory holds, but not necessarily as strongly as I thought it would. I think that's a more honest and interesting conclusion than proving that it's 100% right. Disney and Pixar are obsessed with grief across the board, but there is something different about which stories get to treat grief as a side effect of a bigger adventure versus which stories make grief the whole point. Hey, director's commentary here. I'm coming to you all after I, did the video recording of this, because I think I found a much cleaner way to say what I was trying to say when it comes to evaluating the results of, this experiment. And so, of course, Disney uses grief across the board, regardless of the intended audience. But I think the real reason why it feels a little different sometimes when I think about movies that are targeting children of color is mainly because there are 2 films specifically that are coming to mind that feel a little different, because instead of focusing on grief itself, which is a part of the human condition, they're actually focusing on existential questions about death and what happens to people after, and how are you remembered, and is your life worth was your life worth living? And to me, while I understand that a lot of children are not going to understand the fullness of what it means to ask existential questions. I just think that it is interesting that while we have movies like Up and Onward that are exploring themes of grief and losing people and figuring out how to heal and move on, we have a movie like Coco that explores the actual afterlife and what happens after someone passes away when it comes to the Dia de los Muertos cultural celebration. Or we have Soul, about the main character literally dies in the first 10 minutes and goes through the great beyond or the great before. And, these are hard-hitting questions that people have been asking since the dawn of time. And sometimes it just feels like, do we have to ask these questions to children, let alone children of color? Like, I understand wanting to explore Dia de los Muertos. I think Soul and Coco are very well done. They are beautiful. They are well put together. I feel like they are really culturally informed, at least to my knowledge. And I think that they're great movies that of course should exist. And I think that the world is better for having them exist. I just think it's weird how the two more intense stories about existentialism and what it means to be in this world and then what happens after are, a little Mexican boy and a black man. And, of course in Soul also Joe spent most of his time as a cat. So there's that. But the point I'm trying to make is the reason why it felt a little different to me and why I did this experiment in the first place is that I think that Soul and Coco specifically double click into death in a way that these other Disney and Pixar movies don't. And so my whole thing was, black and brown children have it hard enough in the world. They don't have enough softness. They don't have enough gentleness. And it would be lovely if we could make the stories that are about them be centered around the fact that they are escaping and that they deserve to feel the Disney and Pixar magic without having to answer questions that, Socrates and Plato and everyone before them have been asking. So yeah, I think that that's really why I felt that there was such a disparity. And, after evaluating everything, I see that the difference is not that big when it comes to grief, but there does seem to be a little bit of a difference if we're going deeper and double clicking into existentialism and what it means to live and die. So that's what I was trying to say. So let's bring it back to where we started. A DVD, a behind the scenes feature, a producer saying the death of one older man was too traumatic for the audience. I was 14 years old and something about that moment stuck with me. Didn't have the language for it then, so I went and built a whole scoring system trying to find the language for it. And what I found is that the truth is actually way more nuanced than what I felt in that moment and before I did all this research. But it's not nothing. The gap in the scores is modest, okay? The gap in the editing room is kind of where the story actually lives. What film falls to the editing room floor, okay? But just as we saw in the distribution, the highest grief scores on this entire scale belong predominantly to films made for audiences of color. And I think that that's worth sitting with, even if the averages don't scream it. Every child deserves to be held gently through hard things that show up in their stories. Every child, regardless of who they are or what characters they see themselves in on screen, deserves stories that acknowledge grief without making it the whole weight of the world. I think that's a conversation worth having. And generally, I think Disney and Pixar do okay. And it seems like in the later films, they might be getting away from considering grief and death in the same way. But it was just something that I noticed and wanted to examine. And now I have my opinion, but I want to hear yours, okay? What do you think? Did you notice this pattern? Did any of the scores surprise you? Is there a film that I should have included that I didn't? Is there a film that I scored too high or too low? Because my scale is completely made up, y'all, and I'm absolutely open to hearing your thoughts and ideas on it. So find me in the comments. Of course, always be respectful and be curious and bring your own experience. I think that really is the whole point of the VopEd series. series is to explore my feelings, explore my opinions, and see if there's any real weight to them. So this has been the first episode of the VopEd series. I am Kiara, and I don't know how often I'll be releasing these, but be on the lookout. We are coming back with our podcast in October for season 3. It's going to be a lot of fun. So make sure you stick around, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all of that good stuff. Okay? Peace out, home slices, and I'll see y'all next time.